Imagine a corrupt cop, drunk on power, humiliating a black woman in court, only to realize too late she's his new boss. What happens next? Justice? Revenge? Or a game far more dangerous than he ever expected? Stay tuned. The air inside the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters was thick with unspoken tension. Alicia Carter had walked through these halls before, but today was different. The weight of her new title, Chief of Police, rested on her shoulders like a challenge thrown into the heart of a system that had never fully accepted someone like her. She kept her steps steady as she moved toward the main briefing room. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished tile floor echoed in the silence. Conversations dimmed as she passed, some officers barely masking their curiosity, others making no effort to hide their skepticism. Alicia had spent years in law enforcement, working her way up from patrol to detective, then captain. She had broken cases that others couldn't, navigated politics most wouldn't dare touch. But none of that mattered as much as the color of her skin and the fact that she was a woman stepping into a position traditionally dominated by men like Jack Reynolds. He was already waiting when she entered the room. Seated near the front, the lieutenant leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't stand when she walked in. Most of the room followed his lead. Alicia met his gaze and held it, her expression unreadable. She had encountered men like Reynolds her entire career. Men who mistook arrogance for strength, who believed that tenure alone granted them authority. The difference now was that she outranked him, and that, she knew, would eat at him. The meeting was brief, formalities mostly, protocol updates, community engagement initiatives, a rundown of pending cases. Reynolds didn't speak once, but his silence was as loud as any protest. When the meeting adjourned, Alicia gathered her files, making a mental note of the faces she'd need to watch. As she reached the door, a low voice stopped her. "You should be careful, Carter. Reynolds doesn't take well to losing ground." Alicia turned, finding Officer Dean, a veteran who had been with the department for over 20 years. His tone wasn't hostile, but there was something in his eyes, a warning. Perhaps. She gave him a small nod, then walked out without another word. Outside, the sky had darkened. The city hummed with its usual chaos, sirens in the distance, headlights cutting through the night. Alicia exhaled, allowing herself a moment to process before heading to the parking lot. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught movement in her rearview mirror. A patrol car sat idling at the far end of the lot, its engine running, its lights off. She pulled out slowly, testing to see if it would follow. It did. Alicia kept her breathing steady, adjusting her grip on the wheel. She took a longer route home, weaving through side streets, doubling back through a neighborhood she knew well. Each turn, each stoplight, the car remained a presence in the distance. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. She pulled over, scanning the empty street around her. Nothing. A message had been sent. Alicia didn't need to hear the words to understand them. The morning sun hung low over the city as Alicia steered her car through a neighborhood where history lingered in every crack of the pavement. South Los Angeles had seen its fair share of headlines, stories of violence, protests, and deep-seated mistrust between law enforcement and the people who lived here. She had spent years working cases in districts like this, walking the same streets, speaking with the same families who had learned not to expect justice when it came to officers like Jack Reynolds. Today, though, she wasn't here as a detective. She was here as the chief. And that meant every set of eyes watching her car roll past carried expectation, skepticism, or something in between. The flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror before she even heard the siren. Alicia exhaled slowly, guiding her car toward the curb with practiced ease. She kept both hands on the wheel as the patrol vehicle pulled up behind her, its headlights casting long shadows against the buildings. A second later, the driver's door swung open, and she saw exactly what she expected. Jack Reynolds. He took his time walking up to her window, moving like a man who had already decided how this encounter would play out. When he stopped beside her car, his fingers tapped lazily against the holster at his waist. License and registration. His voice was steady, almost bored, like he had done this 100 times before. Alicia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Is there a reason for this stop?" Lieutenant? Reynolds' lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Routine check. Unless you have a problem with that. Chief? She reached for her glove compartment, keeping her movements deliberate. Reynolds didn't flinch, but she saw the way his fingers tensed slightly against the leather of his belt. She handed him her identification. He barely glanced at it before making a show of inspecting the registration papers, dragging the moment out longer than necessary. You know, he mused, flipping through the documents. Seems to me you were driving just a little under the speed limit. Almost like you were trying too hard to be careful. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with something cold and amused. Would hate to think you don't trust your own officers to keep you safe out here. Alicia held his stare. Or maybe I just know better than to speed through a neighborhood where people already have enough reasons to be afraid of patrol cars. Reynolds let out a soft chuckle. That's cute, but let me remind you, Chief, out here, titles don't mean a damn thing. Out here, it's about who's in control. A movement in the distance caught her attention. Across the street, a young man stood near the entrance of a corner store. His phone raised just slightly, recording. Reynolds followed her gaze, and something in his face shifted. Not fear, not quite anger, just mild irritation, as if someone had interrupted a game he expected to win. He straightened, handing her papers back with a flick of his wrist. You're free to go, he said, but as Alicia reached for the gear shift, he leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. You can play your little leadership game all you want, but on these streets, I am the law. Alicia didn't respond. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving Reynolds standing there, his smirk fading as she disappeared into the traffic. But the unease in her stomach remained. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, she expected to see the young man still standing outside the store, his phone in hand, but he was gone, and that was the part that unsettled her the most. Alicia sat in her office, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The precinct outside her door buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, phones ringing, officers moving between desks, quiet conversations that never quite reached the level of distraction. But she wasn't listening. Her focus was locked on the computer screen in front of her. Jack Reynolds had a record, though not the kind that showed up in a criminal database. With a few keystrokes, she had accessed the department's internal files. Every officer had a personnel file, a history that detailed commendations, training records, and, in some cases, disciplinary actions. Reynolds' file was thicker than most. Multiple complaints of excessive force, unlawful detainment, harassment, yet, every single case had been dismissed, marked with the same phrase: lack of sufficient evidence. Alicia leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping absently against the desk. Something was off. She clicked through old case reports, scanning for familiar names. That's when the pattern emerged. The people who had filed complaints, victims of wrongful arrests, excessive force, or worse, had all either vanished from public record or refused to cooperate further after the initial report. One name stood out: Malik Thompson. Alicia's stomach tightened as she reached for her phone. She pulled up the notes from the day before, where she had jotted down the young man's name after seeing him record the traffic stop. If anyone had captured evidence of Reynolds' behavior, it was him. She dialed. The line rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Alicia frowned, then checked her email, searching for any police reports or incident logs with his name. Nothing. No arrests. No citations. Just gone. Something wasn't right. She grabbed her coat and car keys. If Malik wasn't answering, she'd go find him herself. The neighborhood was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural for a place that usually pulsed with the sounds of life. Kids playing, music drifting from open windows, conversations spilling from front porches. A group of young men stood near the entrance of a small convenience store. Alicia pulled over and stepped out, approaching them with the ease of someone who had walked these streets before. Anyone seen Malik Thompson? The group exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something more guarded. One of them, a tall kid in a Lakers hoodie, spoke up. He left. Alicia's pulse quickened. Left where? Dunno, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. He just said he had to go. Alicia studied him. Did he say why? The boy hesitated, then pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. After a second, he turned the screen toward her. A single text from Malik. They're watching me. I have to leave. Alicia felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. She nodded, stepping back toward her car. If he reaches out, tell him to call me. He's not in trouble, but he might be in danger. The boy nodded, but the look in his eyes told her what she already suspected. Malik wouldn't be calling anyone. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Someone had gotten to him. She was halfway down the block when it happened. The sharp crack of gunfire split the air. Alicia barely had time to react before something struck her car. Metal screeching against metal as a bullet tore through the edge of her doorframe. She ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tires screeched in the distance as an unseen vehicle sped away. Her hands were steady as she reached for her phone. A single message had appeared on her screen. Stop now while you still can. Alicia paced her apartment, her mind racing. The bullet hole in her car door was more than a warning. It was a message. Someone wanted her to back off. And whoever they were, they had resources. She had debated filing a report. But deep down, she already knew what would happen. It would get buried, dismissed, or worse, twisted into something that made her look like the problem. No, she had to handle this on her own. She needed someone who understood the game as well as she did. Someone who had spent years fighting the same system from a different battlefield. That's why she found herself outside a modest office building on the edge of downtown. The name Marcus Hayes printed in small, unassuming letters on the glass door. Inside, the office smelled like coffee and old paper. Stacks of legal files lined the bookshelves. And behind a cluttered desk sat Marcus himself. A man who had built a reputation taking on cases that no one else dared to touch. He looked up from a file, eyes narrowing when he saw her. If you're here, it means things are worse than usual. Alicia closed the door behind her. Someone took a shot at me last night. Marcus exhaled sharply, setting his pen down, and I'm guessing it wasn't some random act of street violence. She shook her head. This wasn't a warning from the outside. This was someone inside the department. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. You think it's Reynolds? He's part of it, she said, but I don't think he's working alone. Marcus tapped his fingers against the desk. That's not surprising. Men like him don't operate in isolation. They're protected. By the system. By their own people. If he's coming after you, it's because he thinks he can get away with it. Alicia folded her arms. Then I need to make sure he doesn't. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained grim. Be careful. If he's as connected as I think, they won't just try to scare you. They'll set you up. The words hung in the air longer than Alicia would have liked. She left his office with a nagging sense of unease. She knew Marcus was right. If Reynolds and his allies couldn't silence her with threats, they'd find another way. She didn't have to wait long to find out how. She was 3 blocks away from the office when she spotted the patrol car in her rearview mirror. At first, it was just a presence in the distance. Nothing unusual, but as she made a right turn, the car followed. Another turn. Still there. Then, the sirens. Alicia pulled over, keeping her hands on the wheel as the 2 officers approached. She didn't recognize them, but their stance, their demeanor, it all felt familiar. One of them leaned down to her window. License and registration. Alicia met his gaze. Mind telling me why I was stopped? The officer didn't answer. Instead, his partner circled around to the passenger side and tapped on the glass. Step out of the vehicle. Chief Carter. She didn't move. I don't see a reason for that. The first officer's expression didn't change. Step out of the vehicle. Alicia clenched her jaw but complied. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know when a situation was already decided. As soon as she was out of the car, the second officer opened the passenger door, reached inside, and pulled something from under the seat. A small plastic bag, white powder inside. He held it up between his fingers. Well, look at that. Alicia's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew exactly what was happening, but knowing didn't make it any less infuriating. The first officer stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You should have listened when you had the chance. Then, the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Around them, Bystanders had started to gather. Phones raised, cameras rolling. The officers didn't care. They shoved her toward the squad car, forcing her inside as the crowd murmured in disbelief. By the time she was driven to the precinct, the news had already spread. And when she was escorted inside, Jack Reynolds was waiting. He was sitting in one of the chairs near the processing desk. His posture relaxed, his smirk unmistakable. He didn't even bother standing up. "I told you, Carter," he said, tilting his head. "Out here, I am the law." The holding cell was smaller than Alicia had expected. 4 walls of dull concrete, a metal bench bolted to the floor, and an overhead light that buzzed faintly. The air was stale, thick with the scent of sweat and something metallic that clung to the back of her throat. She sat still, hands resting on her lap, her breathing controlled. She had been in precincts like this before, but always on the other side of the bars. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. A pair of officers passed by, pausing just long enough for one of them to glance in her direction and smirk. "Chief Carter," he said, dragging out the words with mock reverence. "Never thought I'd see the day. Drug charges, huh? Guess the pressure finally got to you." His partner chuckled. "Goes to show, put a badge on the wrong person, and they'll still end up like the people they claim to protect." Alicia didn't respond. She had seen men like this before, the ones who mistook cruelty for humor, who thought a uniform made them untouchable. Another officer walked by, a woman this time. Alicia recognized her. Detective Monroe. Someone she had worked with briefly years ago. Monroe didn't smirk, didn't sneer. She just gave Alicia a look, something close to sympathy, before moving on. That was almost worse. Alicia clenched her fists, nails pressing into her palms. She knew how this worked. A false charge, a staged arrest, enough of a stain on her record to make the public question her integrity. If they succeeded, it wouldn't matter what evidence she had against Reynolds. No one would listen. She had to get out of here. A metallic click broke the silence. The cell door slid open, and a familiar voice filled the room. "Hope you weren't getting too comfortable." Alicia looked up to see Marcus Hayes standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing expression on his face. She stood. "Took you long enough." "Yeah, well," Marcus sighed, handing over a stack of paperwork to the processing officer. "Turns out bailing out a police chief isn't as simple as bailing out the usual clients. Lot of paperwork, lot of red tape." The officer behind the desk barely glanced at the documents before unlocking the last restraint around Alicia's wrists. "She's free to go." Alicia rolled her shoulders, shaking off the stiffness as she followed Marcus out into the main lobby. The stairs followed her all the way to the exit, but she didn't give anyone the satisfaction of looking back. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. She took a deep breath, letting the city fill her lungs. Marcus shoved his hands into his pockets. "You know this isn't over, right?" Alicia nodded. "I never thought it was." They walked toward his car. But before Alicia could reach for the door handle, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, almost amused. "You really think you can win this, Carter?" Alicia didn't respond. "You're nothing but a pawn. You think you're fighting Reynolds, but you have no idea what you're up against. If I were you, I'd take my little victory tonight and walk away while I still could." Alicia's grip tightened around the phone. "That's not going to happen." A small chuckle, then silence. The call ended, leaving only the distant hum of the city. Marcus frowned. "Who was that?" Alicia exhaled slowly, staring down at the screen. "Not Reynolds." She tapped her screen, opening her recent call log. The number was gone. She checked her messages. The conversation wasn't there. Her stomach tightened as she navigated to her saved files. The folder where she had stored notes, pictures, and voice memos from her investigation. Empty. Someone had wiped everything. She turned to Marcus, her voice quieter this time. "This is bigger than him." Marcus studied her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said, "I figured." Alicia sat in her car outside a small diner on the outskirts of the city, her fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. The neon sign above flickered, casting a dull glow onto the cracked pavement. This was where Michael Turner had agreed to meet her, a man who had spent more than 2 decades in the force. Turner had seen the system from the inside longer than most. More importantly, he was one of the few people she still trusted. She stepped out, keeping a cautious eye on her surroundings. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. Just a few late-night regulars hunched over their coffee. Turner sat in a corner booth, his back to the wall, a habit formed from years of knowing never to turn his back in this city. He nodded as she slid into the seat across from him. "I heard about what happened." Alicia sighed, setting her phone face down on the table. "Then you know I can't just let this go." Turner stirred his coffee, his gaze steady. "You're in deeper than you think. Carter, I know Reynolds isn't working alone," she said. "Someone is protecting him, wiping records, covering tracks. Who is it?" Turner leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "It's not just one person. It's a network, a group of officers, supervisors, and even a few people higher up the chain. They watch each other's backs, erase each other's mistakes, and when someone gets too close, they make sure that person disappears." Alicia's stomach tightened. "Disappear how?" Turner's expression darkened. "Some get framed for crimes they didn't commit. Some get pressured into resigning. And some, like your witness, Malik, just vanish." Alicia clenched her jaw. She had suspected as much. But hearing it confirmed made it feel more real, more dangerous. Turner exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. 5 years ago, a man named Eric Gaines filed a complaint against Reynolds. Said he saw him beat a young man in an alley. Left him for dead. 2 days later, Gaines disappeared. No missing persons report. No investigation. Just gone. She frowned. "And the case? Sealed." Turner shook his head. "Only high-ranking officials can access it. And even then, you'd need clearance above your pay grade." "Who gave Reynolds his promotion after that?" Turner hesitated before answering. "Deputy Chief Langley." Alicia inhaled slowly. That name was one she knew well. Langley had been around for years, operating just beneath the surface. Never quite stepping into the spotlight but always pulling the right strings. If he had protected Reynolds, there was no telling how deep this corruption ran. Turner glanced around the diner before leaning in again. "I shouldn't even be telling you this. If they find out, they already know." Alicia cut in. "I've been followed. My files were wiped. They're trying to silence me." Turner exhaled sharply. "Then you need to be careful. Carter, these guys don't just destroy careers. If they think you're a real threat, they'll make sure you're not around long enough to fight back." Alicia nodded, but the fire in her chest had already ignited. "Then I need to move fast." She pushed back from the table, tossing a few bills on the counter as she made her way out. Turner followed close behind. "You're not listening," he said, his tone more urgent now. "This isn't just about Reynolds. You're going after something much bigger than one dirty cop." Alicia turned to him. "I know." Turner watched her for a long moment before sighing. "Then watch your back." She gave him a small nod before heading toward her car. The night air was cool, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already piecing together her next move. Then, out of nowhere, a low rumble. Her instincts kicked in just as the headlights appeared. A black SUV barreling toward her at full speed. She jumped back, barely dodging the impact as the vehicle screeched past, its tires skidding against the pavement. By the time she scrambled to her feet, the SUV had vanished into the darkness. Turner rushed to her side, his face tight with concern. "That was a warning," he said. Alicia dusted herself off, her pulse still pounding. "Yeah," she murmured, "and now I know I'm getting close." Alicia parked 2 blocks away from the cafe, choosing a side street where her car would blend in with the aging sedans and rusting pickup trucks. The city never slept, but in neighborhoods like this, it moved differently, cautious, watchful, as if everyone knew danger was just beneath the surface. She pulled the hood of her jacket higher over her head and walked the rest of the way. Keeping her pace steady, she couldn't afford to be seen here. Not now, not when she was this close to uncovering something bigger than Reynolds. Marcus had set up the meeting. He had called her an hour ago, his voice low, urgent. "I found someone." She worked inside the department. She saw things. Carter. Things she shouldn't have. Alicia had been skeptical at first. Finding a witness willing to talk was one thing. Keeping them alive long enough to testify was another. She pushed open the cafe door. A small bell jingling overhead, The place smelled like burnt coffee and frying bacon. The kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. In the back corner, Marcus sat across from a woman in her late 50s. Her thin fingers wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug. Her short brown hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes darted toward the door the second Alicia walked in. Linda Porter. Alicia slid into the booth across from her, keeping her voice even. Ms. Porter, I appreciate you meeting with me. Linda's grip tightened on her cup. I shouldn't be here. Marcus placed a calming hand on the table between them. You told me you wanted to do the right thing. Linda's gaze flickered between them before she exhaled shakily. I worked as an administrative assistant in records. Nothing important, just filing, typing reports, answering phones. She looked down at her coffee, as if the memories were too heavy to hold. But I started noticing things. Cases disappearing, complaints against certain officers going missing. And when I asked questions, my boss told me to keep my head down. Alicia leaned in slightly. You saw something connected to Reynolds, didn't you? Linda swallowed hard. There was a case, 5 years ago. A young black man. His name was Andre Collins. He was arrested during a traffic stop. He never made it home. Her voice wavered. The official report said he resisted. That officers had to use force. But the original complaint file, the one that came in from a witness, said otherwise. It claimed Reynolds and another officer beat him unconscious in an alley. They left him there like garbage. Alicia's jaw tightened. What happened to the witness? Linda shook her head. I don't know. One day he was calling every hour, demanding to be heard. The next, his file was sealed, and his number was disconnected. The complaint disappeared, and not long after, Reynolds got his promotion. Alicia felt the familiar weight of rage settle in her chest. And you have proof? Linda hesitated, then nodded. I have copies of old records. Not everything, but enough to show that complaints against Reynolds and his unit were being buried. I took them home when I realized I wasn't supposed to see them. I was scared, so I kept them hidden. And then I left the department. Marcus exhaled. That's exactly what we need. If we can get that evidence. Linda flinched. Her hands trembled as she stared past them, her face draining of color. Alicia followed her gaze. Outside, across the street, a patrol car sat idling. 2 officers sat inside, their faces obscured by shadows. But Alicia recognized the posture, the deliberate stillness. These weren't random cops on patrol. They were watching. Linda's breathing turned shallow. They know I'm here. Alicia turned back to her. Listen to me. We can protect you, but I need those files. Linda's chair scraped against the floor as she stood suddenly. I can't. Alicia reached for her wrist. Linda, wait. But she was already pulling away, already moving toward the exit. By the time Alicia made it to the door, Linda had vanished into the crowded street, swallowed up by the city. Alicia's phone vibrated. She pulled it from her pocket, dread curling in her stomach as she read the message. You're going too far. This is your last warning. The city lights blurred into streaks as Alicia gripped the steering wheel, her foot pressing harder on the gas. She barely heard the hum of the tires against the road or the occasional honk from another driver. Her focus was locked on one thing: getting to the bus station before it was too late. Marcus had called her just minutes ago. She bought a ticket, one way, leaving in 20. Alicia didn't ask how he knew. Marcus had connections in places most people didn't think to look. If he said Linda was trying to run, then Linda was running. She swerved onto the main road leading to the station, weaving through traffic, checking the time. 10 minutes, maybe less. When she finally pulled up to the curb, she barely took the time to park before jumping out and sprinting inside. The station smelled like old coffee and exhaust fumes. The overhead announcements crackling through an outdated speaker system. A crowd of passengers shuffled toward their respective gates, some dragging worn suitcases, others clutching plastic bags filled with their only belongings. Alicia scanned the rows of metal benches. No sign of Linda. Then her eyes locked onto something. A black purse, abandoned on the seat near gate 7. Her stomach dropped. She rushed forward, picking it up. It was unzipped. Its contents spilled slightly onto the bench. An ID. A few dollar bills. A phone with a cracked screen. Alicia's fingers trembled as she lifted the wallet, flipping it open. Linda Porter. She turned sharply, looking around the station, searching for any sign of struggle. "Excuse me," she called out to the woman working the ticket counter. "Did you see the woman sitting here? Late 50s, short hair?" The woman barely looked up. "People come and go all the time. Lady." Alicia exhaled sharply, swallowing her frustration. She needed someone who had been paying attention. That's when she spotted a young man standing near the vending machines. His hands tucked into the pockets of a worn hoodie. He was watching her. Not in the way someone curious might, but in the way someone who knew something would. She approached carefully. "Did you see what happened here?" The kid hesitated, shifting his weight, glancing toward the exits. "Maybe." Alicia pulled out a $50 bill and held it up. "And maybe you could help me out?" His eyes flickered to the cash before he snatched it from her hand. Couple of guys took her black SUV, parked right outside. Alicia's pulse pounded. "Did you see which way they went?" He shrugged. "North, maybe?" They didn't stick around. She ran for the exit. But as soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she knew it was pointless. There were too many streets. Too many places they could have gone. Linda was gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She yanked it out, her breath still uneven. The number was unknown. A single video file had been sent to her. Alicia hesitated for only a second before pressing play. The screen flickered, then settled on a dimly lit room. A man sat in a chair, leaning forward slightly, his arms resting on his knees. The angle was deliberate, framing his face clearly. "Reynolds." He tilted his head, a slow, amused smirk spreading across his lips. "I told you, Carter. This ends when you decide to stop." The video cut off. Alicia stood there, her grip tightening around the phone, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had no doubt what the message meant. Linda was either already dead, or soon would be. And now, Alicia knew with certainty, she was next. Alicia sat across from Marcus in the dimly lit back corner of a bar. The kind of place where people kept to themselves and the music was just loud enough to drown out private conversations. She had insisted on meetings somewhere off the grid, away from precincts, offices, and anywhere with cameras. Marcus took a slow sip of his drink, then set the glass down. "You really want to go public with this?" Alicia nodded. "I don't have a choice. Linda's gone. Reynolds is taunting me like he knows nothing will happen to him. If I don't act now, they'll bury this just like they buried everything else." Marcus sighed. "You're right, but once you put this out there, you can't take it back. You'll be the target, Alicia, more than you already are." She knew that. She had accepted it the moment she saw the video of Reynolds staring into the camera, issuing his silent threat. "I need someone who can put this in the public eye," she said. "Someone they can't silence easily." Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know just the person. But she's going to want proof." That's how Alicia found herself sitting across from Sophie Ramirez the next evening. A laptop between them, the screen glowing in the dim light of her small office. Sophie was sharp, her eyes constantly moving, taking in details. She had spent years exposing corruption, making enemies in high places. That was why Alicia had chosen her. Sophie scrolled through the files Alicia had brought. Photos, case reports, the video message from Reynolds. She didn't speak as she clicked through them, her expression unreadable. When she finally leaned back, she tapped a pen against the desk. "This is big." Alicia nodded. Sophie studied her. "You understand what happens next, right? If I run this story, there's no walking it back. Once it's out there, they're going to come after you harder than ever." "I know." Sophie exhaled. "Then let's do it." Alicia felt a small flicker of relief. But it didn't last long. The article was set to go live the next morning. But that night, everything changed. She was on her way back to her apartment when her phone rang. Marcus. His voice was strained, weak. "Alicia." She stopped in her tracks. "Marcus? What's wrong?" "They know." His words were barely a whisper. Alicia's stomach dropped. "Where are you?" Silence. Then a noise in the background. A groan. The scrape of something against pavement. Panic surged through her. "Marcus, stay with me. Where are you?" A faint exhale. Then the line went dead. Alicia didn't hesitate. She turned and ran. When she reached his office, the front door was ajar. The dim security light flickered, casting long shadows against the floor. She stepped inside and saw him immediately. Marcus was slumped against the wall, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His breath was shallow, his hand weakly gripping his side. Alicia dropped to her knees beside him. Marcus, can you hear me? He blinked sluggishly, barely nodding. Tried to warn you. Who did this? His lips parted, but the words barely made it out before his eyes fluttered shut. Alicia grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with one hand while gripping his wrist with the other. Checking for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. She clenched her jaw, her heart pounding. They wanted to scare her, to make her stop, but all they had done was make her more determined. Alicia walked through the sterile hallways of the hospital, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow on the linoleum floors. She had barely spoken since she arrived, her mind racing through the events of the last few hours. Marcus had survived the attack, but just barely. The doctors said he had suffered a concussion, 3 fractured ribs, and a deep gash along his temple. Whoever had come after him hadn't intended to kill him, not yet. They had wanted to send a message. She stepped into his room and found him propped up against the pillows, his face swollen and bruised. He looked up when he heard her enter, his expression tight with pain. You look like hell, she said. Marcus gave a weak chuckle, wincing as he shifted slightly. You should see the other guys. Alicia pulled up a chair and sat beside him. Did you get a look at them? He shook his head slowly. 2 guys, ski masks, didn't say a word, just beat the hell out of me and left. He exhaled sharply, then looked at her with an urgency that cut through the haze of pain. It's Sophie's office. Alicia, they have someone inside. Alicia felt a chill run down her spine. You're sure? Marcus nodded. They knew we were going to run the story before Sophie even had time to finish it. Someone tipped them off. Alicia clenched her jaw. This meant Reynolds wasn't just reacting, he was staying ahead of her, watching her every move. If he had a source inside Sophie's team, the article might never see the light of day. She placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's arm. Rest. We'll figure this out. He gave her a look, one that told her they both knew there was no easy way out of this. Alicia left the hospital with her thoughts spiraling. She knew Reynolds was coming for her, but she had underestimated just how deep his reach went. Her phone rang as she drove through the city, the screen flashing an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, smooth, calculated, dripping with amusement. I warned you, Carter. Her grip tightened on the wheel. Reynolds, you're playing a dangerous game. He continued, his tone almost casual. And I don't think you understand the stakes. Alicia kept her voice even. I understand just fine. Reynolds chuckled. Do you? Because right now, you still think you have a chance. But let me make one thing clear, you don't. You keep pushing, and I promise you, Carter, you'll burn. A beep interrupted the call. A new message had come through. Alicia glanced at the screen, and her stomach turned. It was a photo. Her house. Taken at night, the lights off inside, a dark silhouette visible near the window. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let the fear take over. You watching me now, Reynolds? Always, he said smoothly. Then the line went dead. Alicia gritted her teeth, her pulse steadying as anger replaced fear. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She pulled into her driveway minutes later, stepping out cautiously, her hand hovering near her holster. The street was quiet, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, but the moment she reached the door, she knew something was wrong. The lock was broken, the doorframe slightly splintered. She drew her gun, pushing the door open slowly. The inside was wrecked, papers scattered across the floor, desk drawers yanked open, their contents dumped in careless piles. Every trace of evidence she had gathered, gone. Then she saw it. On the far wall, smeared in bold red letters, was a message that made her blood run cold. You're next. Alicia stood there, gripping her gun tightly, her breath steady. Reynolds wasn't just coming after her case. He was coming after her. Alicia sat across from Sophie Ramirez in the dimly lit newsroom, the glow of computer screens casting sharp shadows across the cluttered desks. The hum of conversation filled the space as reporters rushed to meet deadlines. But at this table, The tension was thick enough to cut through. Sophie's fingers drummed against her keyboard, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through the documents Alicia had provided. The evidence was damning. Sealed case files, missing complaint reports, and the video message from Reynolds, taunting her as if he believed he was untouchable. Finally, Sophie leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You understand what happens if I run this story, right? Alicia met her gaze, unwavering. Yes. Sophie exhaled. This isn't just about Reynolds. If this goes live, we're talking about a systemic cover-up. Cops who've been protecting each other for years. You're not just making enemies, you're declaring war. Alicia's voice was steady. They already declared war when they tried to kill me. I'm just making sure people see it. Sophie studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. All right, she said, I'll publish it, but once this is out there, there's no taking it back. Alicia didn't hesitate. Good, I don't want to take it back. The article hit the internet that evening. The headline was brutal in its simplicity. The corruption inside the LAPD. The hidden network protecting dirty cops. The article outlined everything. Reynolds' history of abuse. The missing complaints. The cases that had vanished into bureaucratic limbo. It laid out the suspicious promotions. The pattern of intimidation. And most damning of all, it named names. By morning, the city was on fire. News outlets picked up the story, repeating it across channels. Commentators dissected the implications. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves. And within hours, the mayor's office was forced to respond. By midday, a protest had gathered outside the police headquarters. Hundreds of people stood in the streets, holding signs, chanting for justice. Some had lost family members to police violence. Others were simply fed up with the system that had failed them for too long. The crowd swelled as the day went on, voices growing louder, demanding accountability. Inside the department, the tension was suffocating. Alicia walked through the halls, feeling the weight of every stare. Some were filled with quiet approval, others with open hostility, but no one spoke a word to her. She didn't need them to. She had already made herself clear. By late afternoon, the official announcement came down. Reynolds was being placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. It was a victory, but Alicia knew better than to celebrate. As she left the precinct, her phone vibrated with a new message. It was a single sentence. You really think this is over? Alicia's grip tightened around her phone. Reynolds wasn't finished. Alicia pulled into the empty parking lot, her hands steady on the wheel. The air was thick with the weight of what was about to happen. She knew this was reckless. Marcus had told her as much, his voice sharp over the phone. You're walking into a trap. You know that, right? She had known, but that didn't mean she had a choice. Now, as she stepped out of the car, the night air cool against her skin, she kept her movements slow, controlled. She didn't need to give Reynolds any reason to act faster than he already planned to. He stood a few feet away, leaning casually against a black SUV, the glow of a nearby street lamp casting shadows across his face. He looked relaxed, but Alicia knew better. I was starting to think you wouldn't show, Reynolds said. Alicia met his gaze, her voice even. You said you had something to tell me. Let's hear it. Reynolds chuckled, shaking his head, still playing the tough act. Even now, she didn't respond. Reynolds pushed off the SUV, taking a slow step toward her. You really thought a couple of headlines were gonna take me down? You don't get it, Carter. I am the system. You're just some outsider pretending you can change things. Alicia clenched her jaw. If you were the system, you wouldn't be standing in an abandoned parking lot trying to convince me you still have power. Reynolds' smirk faded. You don't know what you've done. Then, in one swift motion, he pulled a gun. Alicia didn't move. She didn't flinch. If this was how he wanted to end things, he'd have to look her in the eye when he did it. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand why she wasn't afraid. You think I won't do it? I think you have nothing left to lose, Alicia said, which makes you desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Reynolds' eyes. Doubt. But then, his grip tightened on the trigger. A gunshot echoed through the night. Reynolds' body jerked, his hand loosening as the gun clattered to the pavement. Alicia turned, heart pounding, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. Michael Turner. His gun was still raised, his face unreadable as Reynolds collapsed onto the asphalt, clutching his shoulder. Alicia stepped forward, looking down at Reynolds. Blood seeped through his jacket, but he was still breathing. And he was smiling. His voice was weak, but the words still carried weight. "This isn't over, Carter." Alicia stared at him, then glanced at Turner. "No," she said quietly, "it's not." The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee. The kind that sat in breakroom pots for hours before anyone bothered to pour it out. Alicia stood at the far end of the hallway, arms crossed, watching through the glass partition as two officers guarded the room where Reynolds lay. The doctors had said he was lucky. The bullet had gone through his shoulder, missing anything vital. He was stable, recovering, and soon, he'd be out. She should have felt relief that he was out of commission. But she didn't, because Reynolds wasn't the only problem. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. An unknown number. She answered but didn't speak. A voice came through, distorted, almost amused. "You think this ends with him?" Alicia said nothing, her fingers tightening around the phone. The voice continued, casual, like they were discussing the weather. "You think taking down Reynolds means you've won? We were here before him. And we'll be here long after he's gone. You're fighting something bigger than one man, Carter. You just don't see it yet." Alicia's pulse remained steady. "Then maybe it's time I start seeing it." A short chuckle. Then the line went dead. She lowered the phone, her jaw clenched. She had known Reynolds wasn't acting alone. But this was confirmation. There were more of them. Officers. Officials. People buried so deep inside the system that removing one piece didn't shake the foundation. They had let Reynolds fall because they thought she would stop there. They were wrong. By the time she left the hospital, the damage control had already started. A breaking news alert flashed on her phone. LAPD chief under investigation for corruption allegations. Alicia barely had time to process before Marcus called. "They're coming after you," he said. "Internal Affairs is launching a full-scale review. They're saying you orchestrated a hit on Reynolds. That Turner was acting under your orders." Alicia exhaled through her nose. "How bad is it?" Marcus hesitated. "They've got altered case files. Testimonies from officers claiming you were planning to purge the department. It's all garbage, but it looks real enough to buy them time. The city's already talking about suspending you pending investigation." Alicia's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "They want me off the board." "Yeah," Marcus said, "and it's working." By the end of the day, she was officially placed on leave. Her badge, her gun, her office, all stripped away under the pretense of an internal review. They hadn't even pretended to be subtle about it. She had spent years building her career, pushing against every barrier they threw at her. And in a matter of hours, they had dismantled everything. She sat in Marcus's office later that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through every possible move. "We're not out yet," Marcus said. Alicia gave a humorless chuckle. "Feels like we are." Marcus leaned forward. "You still have the public on your side. The story's out. People are watching. They can't just make you disappear, not with all this attention." She ran a hand over her face. "They don't need me to disappear. They just need me to be irrelevant." Marcus hesitated, then slid his phone across the desk. "Maybe not." She picked it up, eyes narrowing at the headline. "Judge overturns suspension. Grants Reynolds bail pending investigation." Alicia's stomach turned. He was free. She looked up at Marcus, her voice low. "It's starting." Alicia sat in a dimly lit office, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of case files and printed bank records. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, courtesy of the man sitting across from her. The federal prosecutor, Anthony Grayson, was a man with a reputation for tearing down corrupt institutions piece by piece. He wasn't interested in petty arrests. He wanted the whole system to burn. Grayson exhaled, tapping his cigarette against a ceramic ashtray. "You're telling me Reynolds wasn't just a dirty cop, he was running an entire protection racket?" Alicia pushed a thick file across the desk. "Not just running it, he was a key player. Drug money flowed through hidden accounts. In exchange, certain officers provided security, destroyed evidence, and made inconvenient people disappear." Grayson flipped through the documents. eyes scanning each page with the cold precision of a man used to hunting criminals in suits and badges. "This," he muttered, "is enough to bury him." Alicia leaned back, arms crossed. "Then let's make sure he doesn't crawl out." For the first time since the case began, Alicia felt the weight shift. She wasn't just playing defense anymore. She had the leverage, and this time, Reynolds wouldn't see it coming. By noon the next day, headlines broke across every major news network. LAPD corruption scandal, federal prosecutors uncover massive bribery scheme. New evidence links disgraced officer to drug cartel protection ring. Sources say arrest warrant for Jack Reynolds imminent. The city was buzzing. Protesters who had once chanted against Alicia now rallied behind her. Public pressure mounted, and even the most corrupt officials in the department started distancing themselves from Reynolds. Then came the final move. Standing behind a podium at the federal courthouse, Alicia faced a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones angled toward her as she addressed the city. For too long, the people of this city have been betrayed by those sworn to protect them. Jack Reynolds was not an isolated case. He was part of a network that thrived in the shadows. Today, that ends. The crowd erupted in questions. But Alicia stepped back. She had said enough. The rest would be handled in the courtroom. An hour later, a squad of federal agents arrived at a gated home on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Inside, Reynolds sat at his desk, a half-empty whiskey glass in front of him. He had seen the news. He knew what was coming. But he wasn't going quietly. He reached for the gun tucked inside the drawer. Before he could grab it, the door burst open. Armed agents swarmed in, weapons drawn, hands where we can see them. Reynolds. For the first time in his life, Reynolds had no backup, no favors to call in. He was alone. Slowly, he raised his hands. The cuffs clicked around his wrists as he was hauled to his feet. Outside, dozens of reporters watched as he was escorted to the waiting police vehicle. The man who once ruled the streets now had his head bowed, his wrists bound in metal. As he was shoved inside, he looked up, and there was Alicia, standing near the crowd, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Reynolds smirked, leaning toward her as the door closed. "You can take me down," he muttered, "but you'll never change the system." Alicia held his gaze. Then, from the crowd, a cheer rose, people celebrating, chanting her name, demanding more accountability. She turned away from Reynolds and toward them. Maybe the system wasn't fixed yet. But this was how it started. The courtroom was silent as the judge shuffled through his notes, clearing his throat before delivering the final verdict. The air was thick with tension. The weight of months, no, years, of corruption finally coming to a head. Alicia sat in the second row, her hands clasped together as she studied Reynolds. He sat at the defendant's table, his once arrogant smirk long gone. His suit, once pristine, was wrinkled. The man who had terrorized so many with his unchecked power was now just another disgraced officer waiting for his sentence. The judge's voice cut through the silence. In the case of People versus Jack Reynolds, on the charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to aid criminal enterprises, the court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. A collective exhale rippled through the room, followed by a murmur of satisfaction. The weight of the decision settled like a stone in Alicia's chest. Reynolds barely reacted. He stared ahead, jaw tight, shoulders squared, as if still convincing himself that he could find a way out. But there was no way out this time. The judge continued, "Sentencing will take place in 30 days. At which time this court will determine the appropriate prison term." Alicia expected Reynolds to lash out, to make one final display of defiance. But instead, he turned slowly toward her. Their eyes met, and he leaned in just enough for his voice to carry. "This doesn't change anything," he murmured. "The system will replace me before I even get my first meal in lockup." Alicia didn't blink. "Then I'll be there to take them down, too." Reynolds let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as the bailiffs pulled him to his feet. She watched as they led him away, his presence vanishing into the corridors of the courthouse. Justice had been served, so why didn't it feel like enough? Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters. Microphones and cameras angled toward her as voices fired off questions. What does this conviction mean for the LAPD? Is this the first step toward true reform? Are there more officers involved? Alicia took a steady breath before answering. This case was never just about one man. Corruption isn't about individuals. It's about a system that allows them to thrive. Today, one of those individuals was held accountable. But the fight isn't over. More questions came, but she didn't stay to answer them. She had done what she came to do. Now, she needed a moment to process what came next. As she stepped away from the crowd, a figure approached her. Judge Harris, one of the few federal judges known for taking on cases against corrupt law enforcement. He handed her a small envelope. "I don't usually get involved like this," he said quietly, "but you need to see this." Alicia frowned, taking the envelope. "What is it?" Harris met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "A bigger problem." Then he walked away. Alicia hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a thick folder, filled with documents, reports, and names. Names of officers, officials, and politicians spanning beyond Los Angeles. At the top of the first page was a handwritten note. "You want real change? This is just the beginning." Alicia exhaled slowly. Reynolds was right about one thing. The system would try to replace him. But now, she had the blueprint to tear it all down. The courtroom was colder than usual, the air thick with anticipation as the judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The final sentencing had arrived. Jack Reynolds stood before the court, his hands cuffed in front of him, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that clashed with the arrogance still lingering in his posture. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. "Jack Reynolds, you have been found guilty on all counts of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The court hereby sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some whispered in satisfaction. Others, likely Reynolds' remaining allies, sat in rigid silence. Alicia didn't celebrate. She watched him carefully, looking for any sign of regret, any acknowledgement of his downfall. There was none. Instead, as the bailiffs moved to escort him away, Reynolds turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice calm. "You know that, don't you?" Alicia held his gaze. "I know you're going exactly where you belong." Reynolds smirked. "I wasn't the only one. You think 25 years fixes that?" He didn't wait for a response. The guards pulled him away, his laughter low but unmistakable as he disappeared through the courtroom doors. Alicia exhaled slowly. It was over. Or at least, this part was. By the time she stepped outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her direction. "Chief Carter, how does it feel to bring Reynolds to justice? What's next for LAPD? Do you think this conviction will lead to real change?" Alicia raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "One conviction doesn't fix a broken system," she said, "but it's a start." And that was all she would say. Later that evening, in the quiet of her office, Alicia sat at her desk, staring at the envelope Judge Harris had given her days before. Inside were names, officers, detectives, administrators, people in power. Some names she recognized, others she didn't. Reynolds had been right about one thing. He was just one piece of something much bigger. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus stepped in, tossing a file onto her desk. "That's everything we have on the next batch of suspects." Sophie followed behind, arms crossed. "I've got my reporters digging. But this isn't going to be easy. A lot of these guys have deep ties." Alicia nodded, glancing between them. "Then we do it right. No shortcuts, no rushed moves. We build a case so solid that no one can bury it." Marcus smirked. "You're really not done, are you?" Alicia opened the file and scanned the first few names. Not even close. She gathered the documents, slipping them into a secure drawer before grabbing her coat. "Let's get to work." As she stepped outside, the night was quiet, too quiet. Then, from across the street, headlights flashed on. A black sedan idled at the curb, its engine humming low. Alicia slowed, her hand inching toward her phone. Before she could react, the sedan's headlights flicked off, and it peeled away into the darkness. Her phone vibrated. A single message appeared on the screen. "You think you've won?" The screen blinked once, then went black. Alicia took a deep breath. No, she hadn't won. Not yet. But she wasn't done fighting. In the end, justice isn't just about taking down one corrupt cop, it's about exposing the system that protects them. Alicia won a battle, but the war for true accountability is far from over. How many more Reynoldses are still out there, hiding behind a badge? And more importantly, who will be brave enough to take them down next? If you want more eye-opening stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths. The fight for justice is just getting started.